Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we are looking into the world of digital social work. Therapy sessions, but instead of being in an office, they are happening through screens. It's a really fascinating topic, and it's changing so rapidly, so we're using this academic article called Consent Agreements, Standards of Care for Digital Social Work Practices, to help guide our exploration. Have you ever, thought about how private and confidential your online interactions with, therapists or counselors are? It's definitely something to think about, especially with technology playing such a big role these days.
Yeah. Digital communication has totally changed how we connect with each other, personally and professionally, and social work is no exception to that. The article actually called it a virtual tidal wave of change.
I like that, a virtual tidal wave.
Mm-hmm.
So what are some of the biggest ways we need to, watch out for when we are talking about digital social work?
Well, one of the most important things this article talks about is this need, really crystal clear, informed consent. That's always the foundation for building trust in any therapeutic relationship. But when you bring in the whole digital side of things, it takes on a whole new meaning.
Makes sense. But can we back up for a second? What makes informed consent so important now?
Well, think about it. When you're sharing all this personal information online, it's like going out into the ether,
Yeah.
There's always this chance that it could be misinterpreted or intercepted or even end up in the wrong hands. So social workers really need to be upfront with their clients about those potential risks.
Right. Email isn't exactly the most secure way to share information. It's not like those old locked formats.
Exactly. And with email, there's this whole other thing about HIPAA compliance. That's adhering to all these strict guidelines for protecting health information. And, regular email just doesn't meet those standards.
So how do social workers navigate that? Are there secure email platforms that can help protect confidentiality?
Oh, for sure. There are PA-compliant email services that are made for healthcare professionals. The important thing is to make sure that clients are fully informed about which platform is being used and the level of security that it provides. Transparency is super important.
Transparency, got it. So besides these platforms, what are some other practical tips for risks?
One really important strategy is to set really clear boundaries and expectations about communication. For example, the informed consent should say what the social worker's policy is on, response times to emails and texts. It's not realistic for therapists to be available 24/7.
Right. It's about protecting both the client and the social worker.
Yeah.
Issue in this profession. So those digital boundaries can really help prevent that.
Exactly. It's a two-way street.
Yeah.
Setting those boundaries also helps clients know what to expect in terms of communication. How often you'll be talking and how quickly you'll respond. It sets a really clear framework for the relationship.
Okay. I'm starting to see how informed consent way more than just a formality. It really shapes the entire dynamic of digital social work.
What else does the article say is an essential element of informed consent?
Well, it really gets into the specifics, like email practices, text messaging practices, and even social media, which, comes with its own set of challenges.
Oh, wow. Social media. Well, that feels kind of scary. Are therapists actually using social media to connect with clients?
It's definitely a gray area.
Yeah.
The article says there's no real consensus among professionals about if it's ethical to look at client information on social media, even if they give you their consent.
I can see why. You wouldn't want a client to feel like their therapist is looking at their Facebook page. It's a slippery slope. But even if you're not using social media directly for therapeutic purposes, it's still something that's really important to address in the informed consent. For example, what happens if a client tags their therapist in a post or sends them a message on social media?
That's a really good point. Those lines can get blurred online. Personal and what's professional, it's all connected.
Exactly. So the informed consent needs to say really clearly how those kinds of situations will be handled, setting boundaries and protecting both the client and the therapist.
Okay, so we've talked about email, text messaging, and even social media. There's a lot to consider. But I feel like we haven't really talked about things.
Totally. You're right. It's not just about the technology. It's about the people using it, too.
Exactly. And not everyone is comfortable with technology or, understands its limitations. So how do social workers make sure they're choosing clients who are a good fit for this type of therapy?
That's where you have to assess if a client is a good fit for these kinds of services. Part of the informed consent process should include talking about the client's comfort level with technology. Do they understand the potential risks? And can they really navigate those risks?
So it's about being realistic and making sure clients aren't, getting in over their heads.
It's a shared responsibility for sure. The social worker needs to be really clear about the limit of therapy, and the client needs to be honest about their comfort level and what they're able to do.
It's a partnership, both sides working together to make sure digital therapy is safe and effective. I'm starting to see how informed consent is, like the glue that holds everything together. But what happens when things go wrong? Like what if there's a technology or security breach?
Yeah, that's another super important thing to address in the informed consent. Clients need to know what steps will be taken to try to mitigate those risks, if they happen.
So it's like having a plan B, just in case things go wrong in the digital world.
Exactly. It's all about having a contingency plan in place. Like, what happens if your video conference crashes during a session?
Oh man, I can only imagine that awkward silence.
Right. But having a backup plan like switching to a phone call or rescheduling can help minimize the disruption and keep that feeling of security for the client.
So it's about being prepared. Okay, we've covered a lot, but it feels like we've just scratched the surface of this topic.
We've laid some groundwork, but there's so much more to explore, especially when it comes to the legal and ethical side of things.
Like that whole thing about practicing across state lines virtually.
Oh, yeah. It's a tricky situation for sure. Imagine, a client moves to a new state while they're in therapy. Does the social worker have to be licensed in both? What happens if there's a legal issue? These are all things that need to be addressed in the informed consent.
Wow, I hadn't even thought about that. It seems like you need more than just therapeutic expertise to navigate all of this. You need to know the laws, too.
Definitely. Social workers need to be really aware of the laws and regulations around digital practice. It's a whole...
See why we need a whole deep dive to talk about this. Okay, before we get into those legal details, I want to make sure everyone listening is following along with what we've talked about so far.
That's a good idea. Let's make sure we're all on the same page.
So for our listeners out there, what are your initial thoughts on the challenges and opportunities of informed consent in digital social work?
As we continue our deep dive into this topic.
So we've talked about how informed consent in digital social work is this whole new thing. It's not just about signing a piece of paper. It's about really having open and honest conversations about the risks and considerations when you add this digital layer.
Yeah, and it's something you have to keep coming back to. It's not just a one-time thing, it's changing and new challenges come up, so that informed consent needs to be revisited and adapted as we go.
It's like a living document that's constantly evolving along with the digital world. But let's look at one specific challenge for a minute. The article talked about how complex interjurisdictional practice can be. What is it so important in digital social work?
It's basically a question of jurisdiction. So, imagine you have a client who starts therapy in one state, but then moves to a different state while they're still getting treatment. Well, each state has its own licensing board and rules for social workers.
Oh, I see where you're going with this. So does that mean the social worker needs to states to keep treating that client?
That is the question, isn't it? And there isn't really a simple answer. The laws are different depending on the state, and it can get really complicated really quickly. Some states have these agreements where social workers can practice across state lines.
So it's like this, like patchwork of regulations. Each state has its own unique set of rules.
Bit of a maze, to be honest. And it definitely creates a lot of gray areas for social workers who are using technology to practice. Like, what happens if a client who lives in a different state files a complaint against a social worker? Which state's laws are we even talking about?
Those are some tough questions. I can see why this is something clients need to know.
Exactly. It's about being totally transparent and setting expectations that are realistic. The informed consent should clearly say where the social worker is licensed to practice and what that means if their clients are in other states.
Okay, so it's like a virtual map that outlines the boundaries of that relationship. But let's switch gears a little bit and talk about record keeping. Important in social work, but I imagine it's different when you bring in this digital element.
You're right. I mean, with all of this digital communication, we're creating a whole new set of records. Emails, text messages, video chat logs, and we need to be storing all those records securely and confidentially, just like paper files.
It's like all those old files are digital now. What are some of the challenges that come up with digital record keeping, and how do you address those in the informed consent?
Well, one thing is that digital records can be hacked or there can be data breaches. So social workers need to make sure they're using platforms and encryption methods that will actually protect the client's information.
Like you're building a fortress to protect all those records. But what about the more practical side of things? Like, where are these files actually stored and for how long?
Yeah, that's something you have to explain in the informed consent. Like, are emails printed out and stored in a physical file? Or Are they kept on a secure server? Clients have a right to know what's happening with their information.
Being transparent and accountable. What about text messages and video chats? Are those being recorded and stored too?
That's where things can get a little tricky. Some video platforms let you record sessions, but some don't. And even if you have consent to record a client, you have to think about all the ethical and legal implications of doing that.
Oh, wow. I didn't even think about that. It seems like another city. So how do you navigate that?
It all comes back to informed consent. Clients need to know if their sessions are being recorded, how they're being stored, and who has access to them. You have to be transparent about all of it.
So you're giving the client the ability to make informed decisions about their own information. But let's move on to the financial side of things. Billing and reimbursement can be confusing in regular therapy, but I bet it's even more confusing with these digital services.
Oh, tell me about it. Billing for these services is a whole different ballgame. Some insurance companies will cover video therapy, but not phone calls or emails, and some won't cover anything digital at all.
Oh, man. It sounds like a nightmare for everyone. How do you deal with that? What needs to be said in the informed consent?
Transparency is key. The informed consent needs to lay out how billing works. What are the fees for different ways of communicating? How does insurance reimbursement work? Are there any costs the client should be aware of?
So you're trying to prevent any financial surprises later down the road. No one get a bill they weren't expecting.
Right. And it's not just about protecting the client, it's about protecting the social worker too. Having clear billing policies can prevent misunderstandings and make sure that social workers are being paid fairly for their work.
So it's a good thing for everyone involved. Okay, so we've covered jurisdictional issues, record keeping, all really important things to think about when we're talking about informed consent. But I still feel like we're just getting started. What are some other challenges social workers should be aware of?
Well, one thing that's constantly changing is the technology itself. There are always new platforms and apps coming out, each with their own pros and cons. Social workers need to stay up to date. Platforms they're using are safe, reliable, and a good fit for their clients.
It's like trying to keep up with this constantly evolving world. And beyond the technology, we also have to consider how society is changing. The article mentions how social media and other online platforms are blurring the lines between what's public and what's private.
Yeah, that's a big one. The way we interact with each other, how we share information, and even how we see ourselves. And it definitely impacts the therapeutic relationship.
Like those boundaries are always being challenged and redefined.
Yeah.
So how do social workers handle all that? How do you keep those professional lines clear in a world where everything feels so connected?
That's something But I think it starts with having open and honest conversations with clients about those blurred lines. The informed consent needs to directly address that. Like, what are the social workers' policies on interacting with clients on social media? What happens if a client shares something personal online that might impact their therapy?
So it's about recognizing those gray areas and figuring them ethically. But let's be real, things can still go wrong even if you have the best informed consent in the world. Technology can fail, boundaries can be crossed, and misunderstandings can happen. So what happens when those things happen?
That's why it's so important to have a plan. The informed consent should outline the steps to wrong in the digital world. Like, what if an email is sent to the wrong person? Or what are the procedures if there's a data breach?
It's like a safety net for the digital world. But beyond those steps, you also have to have those open and honest conversations with clients about what went wrong and how to prevent it from happening again.
For sure. It's about owning up to those mistakes to grow and learn. Transparency and accountability are crucial, even online.
I'm starting to see how informed consent is more than just this legal document. It's really the basis for how to practice ethically and responsibly in this new digital age. But before we finish up our deep dive, I want to turn it back over to our listeners.
Yeah, I agree. Let's hear what they've got to say.
Thoughts so far? What's standing out to you about this topic? What questions do you still have about informed consent in digital social work?
We'll get into those questions in our last segment.
Okay, so welcome back to our deep dive into the world of digital social work. We've been talking about all the ins and outs of informed consent in this constantly changing land. Clear that there's a lot to wrap our heads around.
Yeah, absolutely. Digital social work presents so many opportunities, but also these really unique challenges. And informed consent is kind of like the glue that holds it all together.
Right. It's like our ethical compass as we navigate this new territory. But I think it's important to zoom out for a minute and think about the big picture. How changing the way we think about and experience therapy.
I agree. Let's take a step back. We asked our listeners to think about that at the end of the last segment, and I'm curious to hear what they have to say.
Me too. But before we get to that, I think it's important to acknowledge that technology has already had a huge impact on mental health care.
Absolutely. Just think about how much more accessible digital platforms mean that people in remote areas or those who have difficulty getting around can connect with therapists. It's something that wasn't possible before.
It's like we're breaking down those geographical barriers and opening up a whole new world of support for people.
Exactly. And it's not just about location, it's also about convenience. People can fit therapy into their busier now, you know? They can have sessions during their lunch break or late at night. That kind of flexibility with scheduling just wasn't possible with traditional therapy.
And for some people, that flexibility could be the thing that helps them actually reach out and get help instead of struggling on their own.
For sure. Sometimes going to a therapist's office can be intimidating or overwhelming, but the anonymity of being online and that sense of control that you have can really help lower those barriers.
Right. It's like you're creating a safe space online where people can work through their thoughts and feelings at their own pace. But, as we talked about before, there are also some potential drawbacks like nonverbal cues you get in person. There's the risk of technology issues, and it's harder to maintain those professional boundaries when everything is so connected.
It's a balancing act, for sure. And we have to be really thoughtful about how we approach digital social work. It's important to keep in mind both the benefits and the potential downsides.
Absolutely. But let's hear what our listeners say. How do you think technology is changing the way we access and experience therapy?
I'm really interested in their perspectives. After all, their voices are the ones that matter most.
Exactly. It's all about understanding their needs and concerns and what they hope to see for the future of mental health care as technology continues to evolve.
So to our listeners, what questions have come up for you as we've been talking about all this?
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of digital social work. It's a topic that we'll definitely be revisiting as this field keeps changing